Welcome to the Rich Equation Podcast. Rich Equation Podcast. Are you ready to discover how to live rich today and not wait for retirement? If you're tired of struggling and want to live your best life now, you're in the right place. Outdated principles will no longer work in today's environment. It's time for a new approach. Your host, Ashish and Mike, will help you discover methods to live the new American dream. It's time to start living the good life on your own terms and experience a new way to live. Rich. Now, here's your host, Ashish and Mike.
Welcome to the Rich Equation Podcast. Today I have a special guest, Mike Ayala, the host of the Investing for Freedom podcast, an avid real estate investor and entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur. Welcome to the show, my friend. How are you? It's a real honor for you to be here.
Ashish, I'm super honored to be here as well and excited about the conversation. Every time we ever have one, it's amazing. So who knows where we're going, but I love it.
Who knows where we're going? Well, Mike, the name of the podcast is The Rich Equation. And the first question we always ask everybody is, what does rich mean to you?
You know, I don't want to steal somebody else's thunder, but Robert Kiyosaki said you can measure wealth in the amount of days that you can take off. And that when I heard that years ago, again, you mentioned the Investing for Freedom podcast, but why reinvent the wheel? I mean, rich to me is the amount of days that I can wake up and do what I want when I want. It doesn't mean I don't want to go to work. It doesn't mean I don't want to be engaged. It doesn't mean I don't want to deal with people and employees and customers and clients. But what it means is if I have a day where my daughter or my son or my wife needs me, or I'm just not feeling it, or I'm tired, or, you know, there's situations where this has happened, I want to just take some time off and be with one of my kids. If I can say, you know what, screw it, I got to take today off and there's no one that can tell me otherwise, to me, that's rich.
Did that change for you generationally? Let's just go here. Were you taught that?
No, absolutely not. In fact, I don't think many of us are taught about rich, period. And so I think,
yes,
you know, there's a couple ways to learn. And one is through watching and mirroring and seeing and understanding. And then, you know, then there's the direct lessons that we're taught through mentors, family, parents, whatever. And, you know, what was mirrored to me, and I've said this so many times, and I've learned I need to start clarifying the difference between my stepfather and my real father, because my stepfather is a gem. He's amazing. But so many times I've talked about my father, who was my sperm donor. And you know what? He was a drunk. He was an alcoholic. He was in and out of my life until I was 8. He was abusive, all these things. Right. And so I learned not just on the money front, Ashish, but I learned an example of what I didn't want to be when it came to being a father, when it came to, you know, providing for my children, or, you know, being a good husband. I learned all the negative things, not because he specifically taught me that, but because he mirrored it. And so to answer your question specifically, my mom, you know, after going through her initial divorce and then getting remarried, she's very driven. She's very successful. If anything, I learned hard work ethic from her and my stepfather, but they were both gone a lot. And so they didn't really teach me anything about money. In fact, if I ever heard my parents fighting, it was usually about money. And so, no, I wasn't taught anything about money. You know, the first real probable, like I had a mentor who taught me a lot, and I don't want to digress on this too much, but I started working at a young age because if I wanted to, you know, have clothes, if I wanted to have a vehicle, et cetera, I had to work for it. So I had a couple mentors along the way in the restaurant industry. I was a cook at the age of 15. You know, they taught me a lot about hard work and ethics and that kind of stuff, but not really about money. I think one of my first real lessons around money was in a church that we went to. And then my uncle, who was very, very successful, this is a story for another day, probably if you want to go into it, we can, but my uncle and Kara's uncle had known each other from years past in a different state. And when I walked into the foyer to get married, my uncle and Kara's uncle were like hugging each other. They were crying because they hadn't seen each other for like 20 years. And so anyway, my uncle was super successful. One of the only people that kind of broke the mold in my family on my mom's side. And he gave me this book for my wedding. It was called The Richest Man in Babylon. And in the front of that book, there was a $20 bill and a $2 bill. And he wrote this little thing. He said, the $2 bill is yours to keep. The 20 is yours to spend as you wish. And that was really the first time that somebody gave me something that was like financial teaching. And then I had a couple of other experiences, but no, to bring, it was definitely not generational. I'm first generation success. And by the way, my parents are now successful as well. But they didn't teach me success. So
that's so interesting. Actually, I love that framework of I saw what not to do. You didn't see a good example. You saw the example was in the contrast of. I feel like my journey was a little bit of the opposite, where I was surrounded by good example, but then I did that and I wasn't defining it for myself. I was doing it based on what other people wanted it for me, or how they define success or wealth or richness.
Yeah. I think we can learn as much through parallel lessons as we do direct lessons. And so, even there's a part of me that's, glad I wasn't taught that as a younger person, because right or wrong, I think sometimes, we come in with preconceived ideas either way about life and success and how all that ventures out. Getting to know you a little bit, I talk about like my spirituality, quite a bit. And one thing that I've really realized I didn't grow up in the church, but after some experiences in high school and everything else, when Karen and I first got married, we, spent a lot of time going to church and everything else. And you can take a lot from the direct lesson, but the reality is that, for so many, it's funny because some of the preachers that you hear making the most impact and change in the world are the ones that had the greatest testimony. And this is what people talk about in the church. Like, usually somebody that grabs your attention, they have this crazy testimony. They were on drugs, they killed people, they like robbed Domino's pizza. Like they were hellions, if you will. And then they had this major crazy conversion. There's a story in the Bible, like Saul on the road to Damascus, he was killing Christians. And so when a guy like that is converted and lives a different life, of course it's like extreme, right? But the thing that I realized is, some of the people that have, a lot of times people think that if they didn't have a crazy upbringing or something else, then they don't have a story. And that's just not true, but it's just another frame of reference. So I don't know that, either way is better or right or wrong. It's just what you do with it.
Well, I think that's so true. And I feel like a lot of people are hiding their truth because they don't have trauma. They don't have some like significant negative bad story that they can point to and like, that's why I am unhappy and unfulfilled, like, right? Or I rose from a phoenix, but I didn't really rise. I didn't have any major traumatic experience in my life. But even everyday people, right? I'm listening to a lot of stuff about how, especially raising our children is like, we just don't celebrate ordinary anymore. Everything's got to be extraordinary.
Yeah.
Right. So it's you have all this trauma and everything's negative, or you're ordinary and that's not satisfactory.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so true. And even on the, we get into this a lot and talk about, I don't know where you want to go with this, but
let's go wherever we go.
Employees, I've been accused so many times of not celebrating because I'm an overachiever. Right. And I'm learning, as you just said, to slow down even because, even when we think about like, my kids are amazing, but Karen and I have been talking about this a lot lately. There's certain emotions that we're not allowed to have. Like when as young children, when we deal with anger, like they're angry. And so then when they get angry, you kind of lash out. And the thing is like we learn to suppress our anger. Right. And so we just have to be careful with all that, whether it's around money, not talking about our fear. I know this is the new rich. And that's one thing that I think Karen and I have done so well around is having those conversations because a lot of times, if we're freaking out or we're scared or, even when you're not walking in faith or, how I had a pastor back in the day and, he was telling this story about how they needed like $1 million to close on this building or something. And if they didn't, they were going to lose all this earnest money for the church and all this stuff. And he made this comment. He said, you know what, when something like that happens, it's not your job to worry about it. It's our job to go fishing. And that set me back because, when we get into anger or fear or worry or concern or anything like that, when it comes to money, puts us in the wrong state. And we just got to learn. I know we were talking about trauma, but the reality is, I think that's some of the biggest issues that we deal with is when we don't learn to deal with our emotions and have open communication around it. So whether it's celebrating, which I've been accused of not celebrating with employees, because you know what? Yeah, great. We did what we were supposed to do. Let's move on. What's the next big thing we're going to tackle? But what we have to realize, just as you were saying with parenting or anything else, is like, we've got to stop and enjoy those moments, because what we do, we lash out when our children or our partners or business partners or even ourselves, our spouses, whatever, we lash out when we're not dealing with, or when we're dealing with certain types of emotions. But the reality is, if we stopped and just enjoyed life as it should be, it'd be so much better.
Yeah, we often judge ourselves, right? So much self-judgment. All judgment is self-judgment.
Yeah.
And let's talk about the relationship with money, because you've really leaned into this subject matter of investing for freedom and finding freedom through wealth building. And, you know, this topic about money, most of us don't grow up learning about money, talking about money with our families. And so we all have this relationship with money that can really prevent us from achieving great financial success, which then ultimately leads to our own formula of rich or freedom or what have you. What do you see as like the number one or two trip ups that people have with their relationship with money, and what's the right mindset to have with their relationship with money?
You know, I've actually been, I was at an event, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, and Morgan Stossel, I think is how you say his last name. He was there speaking, and he was talking about the psychology of money. Have you heard that book?
No.
It's a really interesting viewpoint. And so if you would have asked me this a month ago, I'd probably have a different answer than I had today, but I've really been just digging in on a few things that I think are really interesting. And so number one, just like we were talking about trauma, we have to be really careful around the psychology of money, because, you know, your background, your upbringing, your scenarios are completely different than mine. And I'm really starting to understand that none of this is black and white. And so, you know, coming up from an upbringing where we didn't have money, I didn't have anything, you know, people with the same story, same background could go a couple different directions. They could be driven by money because they could say, hey, I'm never going to be without again, and be so attached to money and wealth that they just hold on to it. I didn't really take that route. In fact, until I joined a group called GoBundance 3 or 4 years ago, I never even really paid attention to money. You know, I've thought of money this way for a lot of years, and I'm a hunter. So a lot of people, this might not make sense to, but if you go out hunting, you'll find these livestock ponds or, you know, wildlife ponds, and some of them are natural and some of them aren't. But the reality is, I think everybody will understand this. When you see a lake that's crystal clear, it's because there's fresh water coming in all the time and there's fresh water going out all the time. It's when there's no longer fresh water coming in and water going out that water gets murky, muddy. There's no life in it anymore. And so I've seen money this way for a long time. I just saw that parable like in my brain of the muddy water every time I see these livestock ponds. I want to see a nice crystal clear like lake pond. You can, you know, there's usually a waterfall coming down the mountain, and there's usually a waterfall going down the mountain. You can literally see 40 feet to the bottom of the lake. The reason why is because there's good water coming in and there's good water coming out. I look at money the same way. Money is a tool. Now I have to be really careful here again, because this is my psychology around money. But I never looked at it, oh my God, I didn't have money when I was little, and so I need to hoard it. If I started hoarding it, then it becomes stagnant. And that's how I look at that. For me, if we look at ourselves as stewards of money, and we look at money as a tool, and we do the right things on the front side and the back side, money will always be flowing in and money will always be flowing out. It's when we stop that flow in or we stop that flow out, that's when things get disrupted. And so that's what I really think. If you just put yourself in the center of inflow and outflow of money and just keep them both coming. Now that might be in terms of, you know, building a side hustle or a side brand, which is some of the things that I'm constantly talking about. Yep. You know, we all have our core business or our core job, but how do you get more water coming into that pond? Well, you increase the flow, right? Right. The thing that we want to do sometimes though is hold on to that, because a lot of times we come from a background or a psychology around money where it's like it's not scarcity. From an abundance mentality, right. It's scarcity. Exactly. And so I think we just got to fix both sides of that. And so again, I never really paid attention to money until I joined GoBundance, and then they started, you know, we've got these one sheets, and there's like a score on your horizontal income and all that. And I've had to be careful lately about tracking money too much, because it started messing with my psychology a little bit. Start focusing, you know, I started getting really I'll tell you just an exact thing that just happened to me last week. So we're in a couples mastermind with Chris and Lori Harder. And so we, work this scorecard and everything with them, which you've seen and have your hands on. Well, I might've even mentioned this to you guys the other day. What's interesting is, so there's a question in there. You're rating the scorecard, and my rating around, achieving my financial goals and everything is high. I think I'm either an 8 or a 9, which is pretty high. But then my feeling of security around money was a 6. And I'm like, what is this feeling? And I've really had to reconcile this lately, Ash, because I'm at a place where, and I'm not saying this to brag, but I'm sitting on more cash right now and have more good things going on in my life, yet I'm feeling insecure a little bit about my position. And what I realized is I'm focusing too much on money. And it was really more of okay, I'm sitting on this cash, where do I put it? I need to find deals. And when we get into that point where we're having to find deals, this is where big private equity companies and that kind of stuff go wrong. When they have so much capital that they don't know what to do with it, it becomes a stressor on the other side of it. So too much money, and getting into that scarcity mindset and starting to hoard it becomes a problem. So you got this big pond where all this money's coming in, yet none of it's going out. Well, in the natural sense, it'd just be like a dam that would break. And so you would say, well, that's not a problem. But the reality is the psychology around money is super important. So anyway, I don't know if I answered your question, but I think we have to be really careful, just like with trauma around money psychology, because we all come from different places. But what I know for sure, I don't care who you are. I don't care, what your background is. If you don't increase your inflow and increase your outflow, you're going to get out of balance.
I love that analogy of clean water ponds. I've always heard it with air. Do we keep air in bottles on our shelf? Right? Money is like air. It's energy. It's got to flow. You don't put the air or oxygen inside of bottles and keep it on the shelf. It needs to flow in order for it to be clear, which I love how you put that. I also think that it's really interesting that, once you're blessed with that abundance, your mind can play games on your your mind can play games on you that well, Mike, you need to spend all this money. You need to go invest it. What are you doing? You're not really secure. This money needs to flow because that's the story. I think that's really fascinating. I'm sure a lot of people experience that.
Yeah. Well, I think it also goes even with, Morgan's whole book, The Psychology of Money, which I highly recommend. By the way, I'm super excited. I get a 1.5 hour call with him too, just coming up. And I just want to have him, just dive in, man, dig on me, because that's one thing that I really appreciate about you, Ash, is that you're always trying to become a better version of you. And it doesn't matter how much we know, there's always more to learn. Right. And so anyway, I highly recommend The Psychology of Money book, but it's interesting because, even what we think we know, I think we constantly have to be poking holes in that. And that's what I love about you. You're just always looking for more answers and exploring that. And you're hungry. So I'm hungry. Remain hungry.
It's kind of funny when I appreciate that. And I do feel like I'm always searching and I'm not searching for more, but I want to learn more. I have this thirst for learning and thirst for wanting more. And people often judge that oh, you're just lost. You don't know what you want. You don't know what your why is. And I don't know if everyone understands that it's not coming from a place of being lost. It's more of a place of thirst of there's more, there's always more. I only have one shot, then I'm dead.
Yeah.
So might as well learn as much as I can while I'm here.
Yeah, I love that. And one of my mentors, I was with him last week in Steamboat Springs, and we were having a conversation with a bunch of guys in the living room. And somebody asked him the question. He's done pretty well, multiple 9 figures. So, I mean, he's up there. He's done well. Somebody asked him, when's enough? It's the age old question, when's enough? And I loved his answer. He said, I have enough. If I needed to stop, I could stop, but it's not about the money. He's like, it's about the challenge. He said, the day that I stopped loving waking up and building businesses and doing everything that I do. One of my mentors always says, when it's not fun, I'm not doing it anymore. And that kind of comes back to the freedom question that you were talking about. What does the new rich mean?
You tell that to me.
I love what he said. Yeah. I mean, he has enough. And so I love that answer. And then Kara and I were talking about it when I got back from the event. And I think a lot of times when somebody, comes at you from that position of, oh, you're lost, or, oh, he just doesn't know what he wants, and they don't understand that, or they ask that specific question, Ash, when's enough? Can't you just be happy? Can't you just be like, comfortable with what you already have? You've got more than everyone. When somebody's asking that question, they're coming from a point of lack in their life. David Osborne was the guy I was talking about, and I love it because I've heard every time he's leveling up, he's talking about, how much money am I going to give away next year? Like, how much more can I do good in the world? How many more jobs can I provide? All that, that kind of stuff. That's what usually people are not thinking about when they're asking you the question, when's enough? Well, when I have enough that I can feed 1,000 other people and not have to, worry about whether my family gets to eat or not, maybe that's enough. Or maybe once it's 1,000 people that I'm feeding, maybe it goes to 10,000.
Yeah, exactly.
Or when I can, get to a point where I send in a big 737 jet and help people in Afghanistan, maybe that's enough. And by the way, what business is it of yours? Like, the reality is but see, people don't understand that. And they think you're coming from a point of lack because you're searching for more, wanting more, but that's where they're coming from. And so we just have to be careful also reframing and, and this is really easy to do when we feel like they're attacking us. But the reality is they think that, we're in a poverty mindset or we're greedy or whatever. But and most people that are very successful are very, very, very generous. Well, because it's coming in and it's coming out.
Well, look, I mean, in all full transparency to the listeners, like, I've known you for maybe 9 months now. And one of the things that I've learned most from you is that, no matter how much you have or how much you think who you think you are, like, you do such a good job of constantly taking inventory. And in different seasons of your life, those inventory numbers change, whether it's about money or relationships or, nutrition or health or whatever it may be, mindset, how am I feeling about certain things? And that journey of constantly just tweaking and learning and adjusting and investing and, right, like leaning into how you keep up leveling. Somebody asked me recently, like, well, Ashish, if you had unlimited amount of money, like, what would you be doing? Or unlimited amount of time, like, what would you be? I'm like, to be honest, I do exactly what I do every day. Like, I feel like I am living out the life I want every day. Now, do I have all the time I want? No. Do I have all the money I want? No, but I'm doing the behaviors, the habits, the routines of that guy 5 or 10 years from now today. So I already feel like I've manifested that success, if you will. And I think that's what you were talking about, is that there's never really an end to this journey. And all we can do is keep living it every single day, as if, Kara says this all the time, is like, live your future self today. Like, act and behave as if your future self now. I think that's so powerful.
Yeah, so good. And I'm reminded of, by the way, I don't mean to always go spiritual, but there's a rabbi. I'm not Jewish, but I love this rabbi. I just think we can learn from so many different people in walks of life, but he wrote a book called Thou Shalt Prosper. His name's Rabbi Daniel Lapin.
I just heard this from you. Yeah, tell the story. It's really good.
Yeah, well, he was talking in there about how, we were never designed to retire. And he didn't say this, I don't think, in the book, but I heard this story recently too, like in our older tribal days, when the elders would get to a point where they were, too much of a burden, they would literally walk out and just like walk out to their death because they got to a point where they were a burden on the tribe. And I'm not saying we should do that, by the way, but unfortunately we don't have to do that today. I mean, we can make enough money where we can take care of our elders and that kind of stuff, but just coming back to the psychology around, where we came from as humans, the thing that Rabbi Daniel Lapin said is that we're never designed to retire. Like, the day that we retire, and by the way, I hate that word. And I've said this so many times, because retire, I mean, just even think about the root of it, retire, like we're going into retirement. Like, it's retirement. We're going into our rest phase. And, to spend 30, 40, 50 years of our life working for this golden age day that they talk about, like we've got some dream that when we're 84 years old and we're fat and we can't move and we're tired and we can't fit on an airplane. By the way, I don't think we have to be fat, but
now we should be happy.
Yeah. But we've burned the greatest years of our life, and it's just such a fallacy, and it's so sad to me that that's where we've gotten to. But Daniel Lapin talks about we're not meant to retire. Like we're meant to be a productive member of society until the day we die, and that's how it used to really be. And I just don't think we have that psychology anymore.
Well, our education system needs to start promoting that, right? Our society has promoted. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's not changing. I do believe that it's changing, and technology helps for sure. But the old American dream is not relevant anymore. That idea that you can work for 45 years and have a 401k and save up to your 65, just like you said, and then pretend to be happy at the back, it just doesn't work anymore, right? Those days are gone.
Well, I was literally having a conversation last night at the hotel that we're staying at with a couple guys who were super interesting. And if you want to edit this out, go ahead. I have this thought process that I've never really shared with very many people. And Kara's like, be careful how and when you share that. But
we're going to drop it right now. Let's do it.
We're going to drop it right now. That's what's so great about podcasts is, you're in control. So if people hear this, then Ash, let it go through. And if they don't, then
okay.
That's fine.
Click the next episode.
When you look backwards in time, Kara and I, we just moved to Austin, and we took an RV trip on the way, and we ended up in this town called Ouray, Colorado, which the town was named after this Chief Ouray of the Utes. And so anyway, long story short, we bought this book while we were there that we ended up getting on audio, and on the RV trip home, we listened to it, and it was called The Other Slavery. And they were talking about how, for years, Indians, not necessarily American Indians, but Native American Indians have been enslaved, and there's this long history of slavery. And, there's certain races that are known as, they were slaves, but then there's a lot of other ones that weren't too. And you go back way thousands of years in time, and there's literally, this book was talking about how there was like slave law. So like a slave could buy their freedom. And this started triggering something in me that I've been saying for a long time. And this is what Kara was saying, be careful how you say this, because when we're talking about our education system, I think that people got to a point where slavery was okay for so long. And by the way, I think that is my core value is freedom. I don't care who you are. I don't care what race you are. I don't care what religion you are, even what's going on in our country right now. My core value is freedom. And at the end of the day, we have to fight for that, because the minute that freedom is taken from you, slaves had literally a title. So they had a title that just like we own property today. Mm-hmm. What's interesting, and a couple of things kind of came together and compounded this when we talk about the new rich and the freedom. And by the way, I think America has this blessing on it, because when you look at countries like, over the history of time, very few countries have had the level of freedom and democracy that we have here. And the ones that did, there's never been a democracy that lasted more than 250 years. And we're right on the cusp of 250 years. And so some interesting things are happening. And like I said, once freedom was taken, I've never seen it given back. And so here's the school system thing that I want to really narrow down in my thinking around it. So Dan Sullivan, who I coached with Strategic Coach, he made a comment that this was 2 or 3 years ago. And he made a comment around the founding fathers, when they were writing the Declaration of Independence, they said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? The original wording was life, liberty, and the pursuit of personal property. That was what America was founded on, was the personal property. You have the right to ownership. You get your freedom. But they took it out because they were scared that they were basically building this new legal system. And they took out the right to personal freedom because they were scared that a court would overturn their ability to have slaves. Right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of personal property. And what that meant under our main constitution was that slaves had the right to personal property. Anybody did. So anyway, they took that out. And here's what I think really happened over time. We got to a point where we knew that we couldn't eventually be a nation that allowed this to happen. And so how do we shift the thinking? Well, this is the punchline that I've said for so long that Kara said, be careful how you say that, because this is not about race or religion or anything else. But I think W-2 is just legalized slavery. When we create a system and a process where we brainwash people from the time that they're little, that this is the way we think. This is the way we do things. You grow up and you just be a good manager, or you just be a good employee, and you do what you're told until you're 75, 85 years old. And eventually you'll basically get your, certificate of freedom, if you will. We just shifted the mindset. And the problem with that is, just like in that book, and just like in any nation where there's, laws around slavery, a slave could usually by law buy their own freedom. The reality was that they hardly ever did that, because in order to buy their own freedom, what they have to do, they had to get a side hustle, because they basically had to figure out how to make more income than what they were making. Because really, slaves
it's like a trap. It's like a trap. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
It's a trap. And so when you look at it big picture, forget, the actual, am I actually saying that W-2 employees are slaves? No, I'm not saying that. Slavery is a mindset.
That's right.
Slavery is purely a mindset. There was so many slaves. This book was even talking about it. Like, there was so many of them. They could have overpowered the plantation at times, but they didn't. Why? Because they were in bondage. They were enslaved. And so new rich, to me, I don't care who it is. They've broken out of bondage in their mindset, not the actual fact that somebody owns title to them
Yep.
But when you think about it, we're such a nation of titles, CEO, COO, like director of this, there's like a whole push right now in EOS and all that to like eliminate titles.
Yeah.
And the reality is, what's the first question somebody asks you when they meet you? What do you do?
Yeah, totally.
So we're putting labels, like we're putting titles on it. Like, here's your title. And so I'm not saying that we're actual slaves. What I'm saying is that we're in bondage, and the schooling system and the entire process has been designed this way, and we've just all bought into it.
So with awareness comes freedom. And I think that the mind creates these constructs of security with the title or the job or the W-2. And I think now with more information and more awareness, and we're becoming a more conscious society. That's right. I mean, based on the amount of information out there and the podcast ecosystem, the way that books and everything is digested, social media, there's a movement that can't be put back in the box of increasing awareness. And I think everyone is starting to hear a little bit about it. I talk about this at our company all the time, that like we can't just be turning the crank and accepting that that's okay. Mm-hmm. There has to be more. Otherwise, what's the point? What's the point of all of this?
Yeah.
It makes no sense.
None.
And a lot of people are still in that program, and that's okay. I mean, again, if you're aware and you've chosen it, with awareness comes choice. So if you've chosen it, that's fine. But yeah, so powerful.
You know what I think the bigger issue is? And I think we all get glimpses of it. Mm-hmm. There's a scripture in the Bible that says hope deferred makes the heart sick. I think we all get glimpses of hope. But I think we're so sick and we don't know how. And we've got these, limiting beliefs, things that have been ingrained in us for so long. And that's why I'm, hesitant to talk about just psychology of money in general, because, people's frame of reference, when somebody asks you a question like, will you be a good investor? This is a high level question. I don't know. Like, what's your investment experience? What's your background? Like, I have no idea, like none. So, it's the same thing when it comes to like psychology. And I think, just back to that scripture, hope deferred makes the heart sick. I think so many people are sick when it comes to hope. And so even if they get glimpses of it, they don't know where to go next. They don't know how to do it. The one thing that I will say is that there's no excuse, but my heart breaks for, people because if the only reason that you're where you're at is because you fought and you fought and you fought. I fought the limiting beliefs. Like, I studied hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. I've read The Richest Man in Babylon at least 100 times between listening and reading to that book that my uncle gave me, when I got married at the age of 21 or 20, actually, I was 20. I literally read or listened to that book at least 100 times. And, I'm a constant reader. I'm constantly going to masterminds. I'm constantly putting myself's like I got two of me, constantly putting myself in the room. I'm investing in that. But the reason why people are hopeless is because they get glimpses of it, but they don't know what to do next. And that's why your podcast is so valuable. It's also why you kind of were alluding to this, but in this day and age, nobody has an excuse, because the reality is there's so much free information. I would have killed to be able to listen to this conversation for free 20 years ago. I've been married for 22 years now. Like I had to pay for almost everything back then, even through through CDs, because the first real estate thing that got me fired up about CDs, I was at Barnes and Noble, and on the discount table, there was a CD series by Dolph DeRoos called The Real Estate Investors College. I was in Reno, Nevada, driving to Elko, Nevada, and I put that CD in. I think it cost me $21 or something. Mm-hmm. You can still buy that CD series today. It's like $250, but because they don't make it anymore.
Right.
But I put that, it was 16 CDs, so it was like 32 hours. I put that CD in, and it was a 5-hour drive to my house. I wanted to drop Kara and the kids off and keep going. My point though, that wasn't free. Yeah. I had to buy a CD series. All you have to do is like flip your phone on now, and there's so much like free information. Nobody has any excuse.
I mean, you could get so much on YouTube, free content, free motivation, free information. And you know, I know you were being sensitive to the topic you were bringing up, and
I don't want to get you canceled when you're just
starting. The reason why I launched this podcast is to have these blunt, open conversations that I have the opportunity to have, and potentially you have the opportunity to have, but people are not talking about this in a public way because everyone's so concerned about hurting everyone's feelings, or like, am I going to push, I was having this challenge with my wife about something. I'm like, somebody needs to tell that guy to snap out of it. And she's like, no, don't tell him, like he'll get his feelings hurt. And I'm like, well, that's exactly why I need to tell him to snap out of it, because if we don't say something, then who will smack, who will, and it's coming from a place of non-judgment, but who's there to hold up the mirror? Who's there to help us come up with this level of awareness and help us come to choice, right? And I think that this is the number one reason why I want to have these conversations, and I'm launching this community and this podcast, is because I think that even myself, as you're speaking, I'm like, man, where am I still victim? Where am I still coming from a scarcity mindset? What can I improve? And with a lot of your mentoring and coaching, like being in the right rooms and having the right masterminds and having the right, kitchen cabinets and all of that, so critical to keep that mind healthy and strong and out of that scarcity type of environment. But like, we have to look ourselves in the mirror, and we have to realize that we're the only ones that can make the change, and there's no one else to blame.
So true. So true. So good.
So good. So I guess, the natural question is, like, based on everything you've seen, and this is we have a subject matter expert on the podcast today about this topic. Like, what is one thing that you would recommend people, like you said, if we're lost or confused or we have a glimpse, like what is one action step, one step in the right direction that we can do to start creating a little bit of momentum?
You know what? I'm going to give you what I think is probably the most powerful yet most practical tool that anybody could do, but I want to put some context around it. So, I think that the number one thing that anybody could do is start with some thinking time. And there's a guy, we may have talked about this before, but there's a guy, his name's Keith Cunningham, and he wrote a book called The Road Less Stupid. He's a billionaire now, and I love it because he's an in-your-face type guy. Like, he doesn't mess around, but he said something. So I got to say a couple things in order to get to this, but I think it's probably one of the most important things that you and I could talk about, because if somebody is stuck and they are in that, their heart's sick because they have no hope, then I think this is probably the most important thing for them. So a couple things, all the answers are already in you.
So good. I'm so glad you just said that.
Yeah. We just don't dig on it enough, right? Because and a lot of this is limiting beliefs, and it is trauma, and it's all these things. And even when it comes to simple goal setting, like a lot of times, even if we have huge goals in our own heart and mind, we're scared to say it out loud. Why are we scared to say it out loud? Because if I say it out loud, one of two things is going to happen. Number one, somebody's going to judge me and say to me what I already think. You'll never do that. What makes you think you could do that? Why would you even want to do that? You don't deserve that type of thinking. By the way, we have enough of that in our own head. I don't need people around me helping me.
Yeah.
So, who's your inner circle? Like you gotta really watch that, because we're our own worst critic. And when we have people around us just reinforcing what we already believe about our bullshit story, it gets worse. So, there's that side of it. But I think what's great about Keith Cunningham, the other side of it is like, we're natural dreamers. Like we're designed to create, we're creators. And it all starts with an idea. It always starts with an idea. The problem is we suppress that idea because we say, no, not me. No, I would never be able to do that because nobody's going to believe in it. I don't have the money. Where would I get the capital? This is why when the gurus get on TV and they're like, oh, you can buy real estate with no money down, which by the way, you can. And I've done it so many times, but that's not what I'm here to tell you. The reality is you don't need money. Money is just a tool. It's money in, money out. Like when you get that money in the right perspective, you don't need any of that. So the answers are already in you. So what Keith Cunningham said that kind of set me free, I used to meditate. And I still meditate, but when I go into meditation, okay, we're going to do this for 12 minutes and we're going to meditate, and we can't think, we can't talk. Our mind has to be quiet. Like we can't, but the problem, Ash, is like, I get into meditation and like my brain would start solving like complex problems, like answers, solutions. And nope, can't write that down. And then I'd get into this thinking too of, well, you know what, if it's that important, it'll come back to me later. Those kind of thought processes, which after you've done a ton of work, yeah, maybe you could mine that back out of your subconscious. But the minute that I heard Keith Cunningham say this, he spends 45 minutes every single day, every day of his life. And he's a billionaire. So proof's in the pudding. Like this guy's done a lot of great stuff. He spends 45 minutes every day in his thinking chair with his thinking pen, with a thinking notebook. And he writes out a problem or a question, or, a lot of the questions that you're even asking me. People would be like, well, what the hell would I sit down and write? You said this earlier. If I had all the money in the world, what would I do? If I had $10 million to give away, what would I do? Mm-hmm. If, I had an extra $10,000 this year. And I've said this so many times too, because we get into start talking about millions and all this stuff. But the reality is, the average like single mom out there that's just, she just wants to take her kids to Disneyland. So like literally, if I had an extra $5,000, what would I do? I'd take my kid to Disneyland, whatever that is.
Whatever that is.
That thinking time. And let me kind of pull this together, why this is important. Number one, you don't need to do it for 45 minutes. You need to just take 5 minutes and create a zone where you're going to shut out all the, doubt and unbelief and the limiting beliefs and everything else. And you're just going to dream and you're going to write. That's the thing that I would say first and foremost is like, start dreaming bigger. And the best way to do that is pull it out of yourself and start writing, again, what are the complex questions? If you've got, every month, and this probably isn't your direct audience, but, my audience is a wide range. And so this is the thing that's interesting. Somebody could be making 200 grand a year and still be negative $1,000 every week in their paycheck, right? So I don't care how much money people make or anything else. The reality is if you need to make an extra $1,000 a week or $1,000 a month or whatever that number is, just sit down and write that out. Because it's one of two things. We either increase our income or we decrease our outflow, right? That's where we start with all of this. But I think thinking time and learning to dream, we've been suppressed. Like our dreamer, our visionary, our internal person has been suppressed. And I understand why. We've had our ass handed to us left and right. There's never enough money, or I got fired, or, it feels like the more I work, even if I'm working 2 jobs already, the more I work, the more it's get in touch with yourself and start dreaming about what you actually want. So until the pain of your existing situation becomes stronger than what it's going to take to get there, you're not going to do anything about it. So you really have to sit down and shift the narrative from, all the negativity that I don't have enough money, I can't afford this, I wish I could do that. Just change all that. Like, what do I have to do to get this done? If anybody, I could have taken that pathway. I could have, my dad was abusive. He was a drunk. He was an alcoholic. I was this, I was that. None of that matters. Like, I'm going to break that chain. I'm going to break that pattern. I'm going to be the best dad that I possibly can. The freedom aspect, my oldest son, who's a gem, you've met him, he's got a business. And there was a couple of years ago where he was really struggling. And I told Carol one night, I said, you know what? It was Sunday night. I said, I'm going to take Dylan and we're going to go to Park City snowboarding for a couple of days. I just want to spend some time with him, get him to regroup. This is what I call recreation. I hate the word vacation. It's recreation, because when we're going on vacation, we're vacating some life that we don't want or love or whatever. But I took Dylan and we went into a zone of recreation. So I asked Dylan, it's Sunday night. It's like 4 or 5 o'clock Sunday night. I said, hey, you want to go to Park City, go snowboarding? When? Like tonight, we're leaving tonight. He's like, yeah, he got excited. And so we went. There's literally a video that I have from Instagram. I was coaching with Dan Sullivan at that point in time. And, we were talking through his business and everything else. And we're on the chairlift. And I'm like, so Dylan, when you're, struggling in business, this was after we had worked through some things. I'm like, what's the number one solution? Like, what's the most important thing in business? And he said, it's who, not how. Like, he was quoting Dan Sullivan, because like, that's what we were talking about in his business. He was overwhelmed and frustrated. But anyway, the reason why I said all that, I'm always looking at what am I missing in my life? And for me, even at that point in time, I knew that my son was struggling and I just needed the time to go sit down with him and pull him out of it. So it might be somebody that you're missing in your life. People are always like, hey, if you got $1,000 or $5,000 to invest, where would you invest it? That's the wrong question.
It's the wrong
question. Pour it into yourself. Pour it into yourself. There's nothing you can do that's going to change your life if you have $1,000 or $5,000 or maybe even $50,000 to invest. The best thing to do is to change this.
You are your asset. You are your biggest asset.
I love it.
So good.
Did I even answer your question? I don't know if I even answered your question.
Yeah, you did. So okay. I'm not even going to comment. That was so good. I'm going to just let that sink into the listeners. Oof, that was really good, Mikey. Oof. I'm going to re-listen to that because that was really good. I appreciate your time, my friend. I think that was so many knowledge drops. And as a listener, out of this episode, what you're going to really learn is that awareness brings choice, and deal with your understanding of your relationship with money. Like, face it, understand it, right? Deconstruct it. Have a hunger for learning. Understand that when is enough enough? Live your future self today. And one thing that you could do moving forward is just sit in the beauty of the creativity and have a little journal and write and dream. I thought that was so beautiful. So thank you, my brother. I really appreciate it. That was so great.
Yeah. Glad to do it. Happy to be here.
Thanks, man.
Thank you for listening to the Rich Equation Podcast with Ashish Nathu. Do you want more ideas on how to live rich? Go to richequationpodcast.com for show notes and resources. Then take 1 minute to leave Ashish a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. And we'll see you on the next episode.